everybody. Welcome. Welcome to Spui 25. Welcome to this session on the joy of consent, this wonderful book, which is also on sale. Maybe some of you have already bought it. If you still want to, afterwards, you can get your hands on a copy. A Philosophy of Good Sex by Manon Garcia. Also, welcome to the people who are watching via the live stream. It's quite a full house here, so that's really nice to see. Because consent is hot. Consent is key, is something that you often hear. It seems consent is all. We've been hearing a lot about it. And it seems that consent has become like the answer to problems of sexual harassment and sexual violence. So it's really presented almost as a sort of catch-all solution to the problem of sexual coercion. It's also sort of assumed that everybody knows what consent actually entails. Opposing this particular consent regime makes you suspicious, as I myself found out writing about this, because you're quickly accused of being a proponent of the previous regime, which, in the words of Manon Garcia, can be defined as a masculine erotics of silence. Garcia wants to offer an alternative framework to this, and today we'll be hearing from her, as well as from 3 other female thinkers. My name is Linda Duits. I'm a social scientist specialized in gender and sexuality, and I also write extensively about such issues, and I'll be the moderator today. The program is as follows. We're going to start with an introduction by Manon, and then we have 3 respondents, you might call it. So we're going to hear first from Petra from Brabant, then Lilian Chichi, just practiced, Chichertia, and then we have Marie Nicolas. After that, Manon is going to briefly respond to them, and then we'll start a discussion here, and we'll also have room for questions from the audience. So please keep your questions till the end. And we'll be about done at 6:30. I'll introduce the speakers in a little bit when they'll be speaking. But first, Manon Garcia. She is a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows and a junior professor of moral and political philosophy at the Vrije Universiteit in Berlin. She has taught at the University of Chicago and at Yale. And in 2022, she received the Prix des Rencontres Philosophiques de Monaco for the best book of philosophy published in France. And that book was that prize was for the book that brings us here today, The Joy of Consent. It was a joy to read, and I really look forward to her introduction. Manon.
Thank you very much for all being here. It's my first time in Amsterdam, and I have to say that it's a great first time. Thank you to the wonderful women who have accepted to talk about the book with me, and also thank you to Eric Schließer, who made this possible and invited me. So I'm very happy, and thank you to Spui. I'm not very sorry. I'm already trying to learn German, and so it's like adding Dutch is. So I just want to because I know that you haven't read the book, most of you. So I wanted to tell you a few things so that the conversation that we're going to have makes sense for you to kind of situate my project. So I think, as Linda was saying, part of what I was interested in is the very different views on consent that people have. That you have this sort, especially since Me Too, this sort of idea that consent is the key to egalitarian sexual relationships. And what some people don't know is also the fact that some feminists think that, of course, consent is a terrible notion to use, and that, like, this is a sexist notion. This is a notion that allows to justify violence against women. And so, first of all, there is a very big tension. But also, so I wrote this book when I was living in the US. Although I was born, raised, and trained as a philosopher in France. And I think there's something puzzling when you are in the shoes I was in, because when you grow up in France or when you live in France, the common view is that Americans, they don't know what sex is about. Like, we're the ones, like, we know the sex thing. And because they don't know what sex is about, they talk about consent all the time. And in the US, when you tell people that you're French, first of all, for a lot of people, the first thing they respond is, "Oh, voulez-vous coucher avec moi ce soir?" And you're like, no, but also weird, but okay. And they think that French people are basically committing sexual violence all the time and calling it love, and that they should really learn a bit about consent. This takes me to just make a quick warning that I'm going to be talking about sexual violence and about rape, and I think a lot of our discussions are going to be about this, so if you're not comfortable, feel free going for a quick walk or whatever. So I was in this sort of weird position where in France, every time I was making giving public interviews, etc., I was seen as importing this puritanism, and really, like my mentor wrote a public response to my first interview in the press, where I was talking about affirmative consent, and he said, well, if I had to ask women for their affirmative consent, my sexual life would have been masturbation. And he sent me the draft, and I was like, I'm not sure you want to publish this like this. But at the time, I mean, in 2017, it was in France something kind of okay to say. And at the same time, and in the US, I found myself feeling like they were a bit Puritan, and so I felt like not comfortable anywhere. And I was also worried about the way in which everyone was convinced that consent was just a woman's problem. And so in moral philosophy, there's this very important big book about philosophy of consent that starts with the sentence, all in all, what this book is about is to know when a woman is okay to have sex or not. And so it was very clear that consent was only about women. And I found it also interesting. I don't know if you've been following these big political debates right now about should the EU have a general definition of rape. And so I took a stance that was complicated, but I in France, where I said I thought France was right to not want this general definition of rape through consent. But what struck me in the European proposal is that it said rape is when a woman is penetrated without her consent. So it was considering in the text of the law that only women could be raped. And so I'm also interested in this gender dimension because I think having the view that only women can be raped is perpetuating those myths like men always want sex, women never want sex, and sex is always going to be a trade-off. Sex is heterosexual between binary people, etc. So that's kind of what I was hoping to talk about in the book. Then one of the main contributions I'm trying to make is that I think there are two discourses about consent in everyday life, about sexual consent. There's a discourse that is about law. So who should be sent to jail? Who's a rapist? What kind of sex is impermissible? And then there's the sex ed discourse, consent is great, consent is sexy, etc. But what I'm trying to do is to say there should be a third discourse that is the moral philosophy discourse. That is to think what kind of sex is right, in the sense of it shouldn't be prohibited. What kind of sex is good? Is it the same thing to have sex that is right and to have sex that is good? Should we consider that unpleasant sex is morally bad, or that like it's enough to have pleasure for sex to be good. So this is kind of what I'm trying to talk about in the book. And that leads me to one last thing I wanted to say. So, no, two last things. First, about the title. I didn't choose the English title. So the title in French is something like The Conversation of the Sexes, A Philosophy of Consent. And of course, Harvard University Press thought it was not sexy. And so they suggested we call the book The Sexiness of Consent, A Feminist Guide to Intimacy. So most of you haven't read the book yet, but it's mostly about rape. So I told them, well, yes, the last chapter is optimistic, but it's a lot about rape. You can't, like, rape is not that sexy. So we settled on the joy, because I think the joy can be something about between the legal discourse and between the sex ed discourse. So that's what I was trying to do. And the other thing, in case you read the book, it might be confusing the first few chapters, because what I'm trying to do is take a lot of different threads, the thread of law, the thread of analytic moral philosophy, the thread of political theory, the thread of feminist theory, the thread of French philosophy, and the thread of sexual research, etc., and thread them together so that it makes sense at the end and I can make a contribution. But it might be the case that at the beginning you're going to be like, BDSM and Kant and Mill and what is going on, where is it going? Keep reading. Hopefully it's going to make sense eventually. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Am I double now? Seems... Nee? So, yeah. Thank you, Manon. I'm going to give the floor now to Petra van Brabant, a feminist philosopher writing about art and pornography. She doesn't like bios and just told me, because you're somebody else every day. So now I'm trying to mold you into head of the research department at the St. Lucas School of Arts in Antwerpen, where she teaches semiotics, cultural criticism, and art theory. She co-authored, amongst others, Kunst of Pornografie, een filosofische verkenning. Your applause, please, for Petra van Brabant.
Good early afternoon, everybody. I have to do a switch of laptop, so I'm going to do it as swift as possible. I can already say that I kept on reading and finished the book. It's not needed. And that it's worth it. Because there's hope at the end. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm going to try to relate to Manon Garcia's book today, tell her and all of you what it did to me and what it brought into my mind. I made a PowerPoint with images of an artist and an illustrator, feminist artist and illustrator, Elsa B. Mason, who's a dear friend of mine. She's a Norwegian artist, and she works around the work of Elisa Lindenberg, who is the first Norwegian dancer, and who introduced free dance in Scandinavia, and who also introduced dance therapy in Scandinavia. And as a side thing, she was also the lover of Wilhelm Reich, who does a cameo, a small one, in Manon's book. But it's not for this Wilhelm Reich that I invited Elisa to do the drawings, the collages, actually. It's also because she works also, but from an artistic point of view, on consent. So the collages might be offensive, but it's particularly because they are on consent that they are how they are. I also show a few images of basically and mainly and only white male painters. These images are even more offensive, but they are illustrations of some points I want to make. So I first, since I'm the first to speak, want to thank you, Manon, for the work you've done. It's a great book, and as you said yourself, you bring a lot of threads together. You spell out complicated arguments. You ask for our patience to stay with you through these arguments. You make lines, you make complexities visible, but you also bring in very concrete examples, which make it alive and makes it relatable. What, for me, you're doing in the book is a certain kind of joy of consent. The art of the joy of consent in writing, in the sense that you converse with people, you sense together with people about the complexities of consent, and you hope that they will help you and you will take them along this journey of sensing and conversing together to improve, ameliorate, as you say, consent, or what is consent, what you would like consent to do for us, for all of us. So I really appreciated that, and I appreciate that also in that movement you did a great gesture of transmission of knowledge, first wave feminists, you bring them on stage again, and you give them a place, and you also show them we have this consenting today, it's hip, it's like the solutions for all our problems, but they already showed how problematic consent is in a certain male-dominant patriarchal society. So you do them also a certain kind of favor and gesture of generosity and a job of transmission, which is very needed, because feminist theory and feminist knowledge, if it's from first wave till today, is not transmitted and therefore isn't doing the work that it could do for us. So thank you for that. Next to that, I would also like to acknowledge that writing about violence against women and writing again about rape isn't an easy thing to do as a woman. So I think it's very important to address that today. It's actually doing the work twice. You do the intellectual labor, but you also do the emotional labor. And even though it's no autoethnography what you're writing, and it's sometimes hard to find you in there, it's a personal book. It's about you, it's about your body, your experiences, of course, our collective experiences, but your body is inside there. So you're not an outside point of view. And we sometimes underestimate that labor, which is double labor, but you pay the same amount of money. Also, reading the book is not easy. It's also, for women, a painful experience. We would rather remain sometimes ignoring things. You write very beautifully how ignorance is created, to see male dominance as natural, as normal. But it's not, and it serves us also. It makes things sometimes bearable. It makes things sometimes bearable to be ignorant about things, for a while at least. So, for instance, you invite us again and again through the book, and indeed through the chapters until the last one, so it's a painful journey. You invite us to recount, revisit our own experiences of saying yes, of saying no, of saying nothing. You invited me to revisit my first experience of sexual assault, where the body was freezing, the smile was trying to disarm, the heart was beating, and how the memory is a memory of sexual excitement. There's a hard work that you do to reframe fear and violence in excitement. So, what you're doing then, from the first page on, consent is entering the stage as a superhero, gonna solve every problem for us. But already at the end of the first page, she discovers or unmasks that consent is a double spy. It's doing a great job at helping us to protect us, being our liberal guard against state intervention, state prohibitions of sexual practices that are not permitted, allowed, tabooed, whatever. So you recognize that this is a very important job of consent to do. At the same time, you see that consent in a situation or in a world of male dominance cannot realize the promise of distinguishing between sexual violence, rape, and right sex. And definitely not between bad sex and good sex. Because the conditions for women to consent freely, well-informed, and voluntarily are not met in a patriarchal society. And I think this double spy of this Trojan horse, we can call it, of consent, is very, very central to your book. And when I mean a Trojan horse, it comes in and it presents itself as a certain kind of truce for the battle between the sexes, but then you see it's just another avatar of patriarch society. So what you want to do, and why you work so hard through the chapters to really confront everything that has been said and done and written about consent and all the thresholds, difficulties, pitfalls, what you do is you try to find, in the end, an ameliorative consent, a consent that is better, a consent, I would say, that rightly, I'm going to try to read to say it rightly, that rightly describes the context in which it operates, and that it can be a tool for us. Even though you come only at it at last chapter, so as our reading body realizes, the situation is quite bleak and hopeless. In the second last chapter, you talk about the use of consent in court cases. And even there, it often goes wrong. Even though you would think it's a clear legal procedural tool, it often goes wrong. And that related very much to a lot of my experiences as a member of Engagement Arts. It's an organization against sexual abuse and power abuse in general and sexual violence in the arts in Belgium. It's also one in the Netherlands. It's founded in 2017 by Ilse Hekere, a friend and colleague of mine. She's a dancer, a writer, researcher, etc. And she did research about sexual abuse in the dance sector and then came to start this organization. And what we do are very several things. We do peer-to-peer support groups. We do peer-to-peer testimony groups. We collect testimonies. We analyze them. We archive them. We do lobbying to parliamentarians. We do lectures and workshops. We do also campaigns, open letters, also sometimes in rare occasions, call-outs and court cases. Only when we have a lot of testimonies, when they are coherent, and when there's a high-profile figure that we know it will add to stop the repetition of behavior, and secondly, when there is a potential for social change by doing this. So I was part of a court case in the sense of I was a court case against Jan Fabre. And what was interesting there is, so it was an open letter that 20 persons wrote against his sexual abuse in context, what were for him context of consent. 12 of them went to court. And what was interesting and what was really relating to what Manon Garcia is saying in her book is the creation of the myth of the perfect victim. And the creation of the myth of the perfect victim happens as well by the lawyers defending the person who's accused, as by the lawyers defending the girls who are, the women and girls who went to court. And so here you see how the lawyers of those who were defending the accuser framed it, and then how the lawyers who were on the side of those who were accusing him framed it. And this was an extremely painful experience for the women going to court, in the sense that it seems as if your story is never legitimate as long as you are not the perfect victim. It's like, as Manon Garcia is writing, violence upon violence. The same with consent. There was a whole construction why these women all gave their consent. Why she was consenting. She was consenting because she complained, but we told her that he intended well. So why is consent, the idea that you're not consenting becomes invalid because you have already been told that the intentions were good. So what we decided to do with Engagement Art is not to focus anymore on consent as a legal tool or as a procedural tool or even as a transactional tool before you have good sex, but as a conversational tool, as a tool to open, in workshops and in lectures, to open conversations about the grey zone of sex. What does this mean? Looking at the power relations, analyzing the risks in concrete power relations, and seeing how you can create tools, but more important, so solidarity networks, that you not find yourself in situations in which you have to say yes when actually you're thinking or you're feeling no. So this is not the same as what you're proposing in the sense of a conversational consent practice. It is consent as a conversational tool to strengthen and arming yourself. So in the end, indeed, you come to the joy of consent, you propose an ameliorative version of consent, a practice of consent that can do the job we want it to do, to distinguish between rape and legitimate sex, and even, if possible, between good sex and bad sex. And I think this proposition is very valued because you also address with this the durational aspect of sex. It is impossible to say yes to actually what is going to happen in sex, because the one who proposes or the one who accepts or the propositionally together, you don't know what is coming. So in your proposition, and it's maybe not so explicit in the book, but I read it in interviews with you, you consent by talking before, during, and even after. Even if you decide that you're going to drug yourself and have sex, the consent can still be in the post-sex conversation. So it's a very durational practice, ethical practice of consent. There's also room, therefore, for not yet knowing, for experiment, for trying out, for making mistakes, and for reconsidering it. Though I have some questions. I wanted to question if in a patriarchal world, will a practice of conversational consent not also reflect male dominance? And very specifically, who will take up the very gendered, emotional, educational and care label of installing and maintaining a practice of conversational consent? Specifically because conversation is female gendered, and the art of conversing in sense of, and the art of consenting, sensing together, is female gendered. Do we not risk to bring in yet another Trojan horse here, in which women will invest themselves disproportionately, working at a truth that is but another fiction? I would be curious to know, for instance, how Simone de Beauvoir practiced her conversational consent, and if it was so liberating. I know I have to stop. There was another point I wanted to make. It was about your use of your metaphor of the battle between the sexes. And I think that this metaphor is inadequate to address what you want to address. I'm going to go very quickly through it. If we think starting with Catherine McKinnon, and we take it further, and we go thinking with John Berger, Anne Eaton, feminist philosopher Anne Eaton, and even the Moroccan sociologist Fatima Mernissi, then maybe we would rather talk about the hunt. If you look at Western art, and if you see that as our self-portrait of our sexual culture, then it's rather a hunt than a battle. So I think we should rather follow Fatima Mernissi, who proposes the figure of Scheherazade, the person who plots and ploys and plans and plays tricks and is cunning, the one who is setting up poisoning and is tricking in the harem with her friends. His pleasure in the harem is healing from violence in the harem, but again is gossiping, is sending out messages, and is poisoning again as a very prominent figure and to reinvest the battle of the senses to undo the hunt. Voilà. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Petra. I'm going to give the floor next to Lilian Chichachia. She is an assistant professor of political theory at the University of Amsterdam with a focus on political economy, feminism, and critical theory. She has published about this in, amongst others, Hypathia, the European Journal of Political Theory, and Social Theory and Practice. She is also a regular contributor to Jacobin, the Catalyst Journal, and Dissent. Please, applause for Lilian.
Okay, so I'm thinking about my remarks as a sort of invitation for when we sit down to talk more with Manon about some ways of pushing her argument in different directions, because I overall liked the book quite a lot, and I also really liked Manon's first book, which I recommend. And before I start, maybe I'll also say that "Voulez-vous coucher avec moi" is "Ce soir" was definitely my first sentence in French. And if you are too young in the room to remember the remarkable cultural moment that was Lil' Kim and Christina Aguilera's collaboration, you'll know why that was for a rather odd generation of millennial children. So, anyway, so I want to say that some of the strengths of this book are that Manon really points at something like a genuine normative problem with our expectations of consent. So when you start asking yourself, what is it that we want from this concept? I think she's right to say that we want things that are not mutually interchangeable or sometimes even compatible. So I've taught, for example, in my feminism courses, and will this year as well, Linda Martin Alkoff's book, Rape and Resistance, where she has a rather long chapter challenging the idea of consent as adequate. And interestingly, when I teach that chapter, my students usually find it very unsatisfying and provocative. And they want to preserve the idea of consent. And so in a way, I think Manon addresses herself to a real need, and that's specifically that our expectations are that we both want a kind of libertarian view of consent, in which people can just say yes, and it's a contract, and we say, well, as long as they're adults and they can make such an agreement, everything else that follows is fine, and then the desire to preserve the dignity of the human person in consent, because it's quite clear that in those relationships, in the first kind anyway, it's not always the case that our intuitions about what does in fact preserve human dignity in sexual relationships always follows. So I think that's important, and I think feminists, moreover, respond to this conflict in contradictory ways. So I've noticed a real fear of what we used to call gray rape, and which is an oxymoron, but it's something that conservative commentators say in order to create ambiguity around the concept of rape that feminists tend to want to resist, because this is usually cynical and in bad faith. But how to respond to genuine questions about what Manon calls the gray zone. And it probably has something to do with these contradictory desires we have from the concept of consent. And this is probably especially important since 2017, since the Me Too discourse emerged and has since petered out somewhat, because it struck me that at the end of that period of time, or at least in the midst of it, that we both gained and lost our ability to trust one another to mitigate conflicts over consents in pretty short amount of time. So I remember, on the one hand, there is a lot of critiques of carceral feminism and relying too much on the state to mitigate these conflicts and all the obvious shortcomings of the law. But then in private circles or friendship circles or activist circles, it was also quite clear that the idea of restorative justice was not doing the work that people hoped that it would. Very punitive, strong-arming attitudes were also very common in activist circles and among friends. The other thing that I think is important about this text is a sort of rehabilitation of and taking thinkers seriously who aren't often considered systematically. There's a through line, I think, between figures like Simone de Beauvoir on the idea of submission, Catherine McKinnon on law, and Carol Pateman on contract. And this is a through line that isn't often drawn. So if that kind of motivates the more theoretically inclined to read the book, I think it's very valuable. So some of my, I'll just have a couple of questions. One of them is big picture. it struck me at one point in the book that Manon raised the issue of the ambivalent role of the sexual revolution in women's lives, and that in some sense our confusion over the concept of consent is somehow downstream of this ambivalent role of the sexual revolution in women's lives. And if you're wondering which one, the 60s, I would say, is really the beginning of the sexual revolution. And it's something to which the feminist movement or the women's liberation movement reacted toward, because it was emerging as a problem that sexual liberation or sexual revolution meant for men. And women's movements responded to that in kind. And I think that this is still an unresolved issue. There are unresolved tensions between women's autonomy, okay, and this is not just in our sexual lives, but autonomy, our relationship to birth control, for instance, abortion, reproductive rights on the whole, sexual violence, and also with women's work. And I think that there are a couple different cultural reactions to this situation, that feminism there's a generation of people that are both attracted to feminism but sense the ambivalence of this impact of the sexual revolution and the inability of waves of feminism's past to deal with it, that prompts both interest in feminism and almost simultaneous disillusionment with it. You're almost always told why the theories you're reading are not good enough as opposed to where they could go in the future. So two reactions that I think are important, maybe outside of the feminist orbit, are the new wave of, say, reactionary feminism. So someone like Mary Harrington. There is a new wave of women who are vocalizing this disillusionment with feminism and kind of retreating to gender complementarism in their sexual lives, in their personal lives, and in terms of their work. There are also real changes in the position of men in advanced capitalist societies. Male employment, levels of sociability and isolation are also, well, male employment is on the decrease since the pandemic and since the effects of deindustrialization, and also the levels of sociability and isolation and the frequency of sexual partners is going down. So apparently, in 2022, 30% of American men reported having no sex in the past year between the ages of 18 and 30. Women, by contrast, are at 18%, which is holding steady at 2000 levels. So when I say there's a real problem of isolation, loneliness, that would probably spark feelings of entitlement, resentment, underconfidence, or bitterness, these are symptoms of social alienation. And it seems like, obviously, one response would be reactionary feminism, and another would be anti-feminism in its more extreme forms. I see Manon's book, in a way, trying to give some kind of response to this dilemma, the disillusionment with feminism's past. So I want to ask if maybe that's a direction we could push the conversation. In what sense is the book a response to this situation of disillusionment and trying to chart a feminist path forward that doesn't retreat back into gender complementarism and also has a feminist response to the problems, especially if all is not actually all right with boys and men? So how might it now be time to re-up on the idea that feminism or a feminist future is better for everyone? And I thought this was something that at the end of the book, in the idea of sex as a conversation, Manon tries to insist on, which is that there was always a view of a feminism for everybody, that actually women's submissiveness or women's subordination to men is not good for men. Being alienated from your partners, not feeling satisfied in your sexual lives, or not having good communication or genuine intimacy is not good for men. The last thing I'll say is that I wonder what needs to change on the whole. So there is the call at the end of the book is for a general for social movements to change substantively our social relationships, to make these conversations and to make sexual equality possible. I also wonder if there is, if there's something to be gained by putting this conversation into putting the question of consent in the conversation you're having into one that is of a piece with a general analysis of patriarchy and women's work in, sorry, that must have been me, and women's work as a part of what patriarchy is in the social structure. So women's work is sort of a fundamental feature of the ambiguity of women's submission in capitalist societies. And changing it changes the position of women in those societies. And one of the problems with the feminism of waves past, including the third, is that it has not resolved this. It has not given an answer for how to create egalitarian relationships from which egalitarian sexual relationships follows. The shortcomings of the girl boss are clear. The position of working class women is getting worse. Social democracy has not been able to provide the kind of gender equality that was hoped. And there's a problem of dependency on the welfare state and many well-known feminist criticisms of where we have ended up. So in a way, this conversation is a part of something broader about how to have a more expansive feminist vision going forward. And I think that connection between work and sexual violence, or the structure in sexual violence, is rather important. Because I'm thinking of interventions like those of Angela Davis or Silvia Federici or the Lestices Collective in Chile, where they see the submission of women in the household and women in society in general and to the state as the production of violence. So in a way, violence is itself a part of the social structure, and it is sexual at the same time. And this is something that McKinnon dwells on at great length. And I'll just say the last thing I was thinking is that if what's at stake is really a reconceptualization of the idea of feminist freedom and sexual freedom as a part of that, then we're in a way back to where Simone de Beauvoir left us in 1949 at the end of The Second Sex, which is toward liberation. And she says we have to deal with the problem of women's work, women's economic inequality, dependence both within the household, on the state, and on the market. And if we can solve these problems, then we may be able to transform the emotional spectrum that comes with them. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Lilian, for these observations and questions for Manon. Then our final respondent, so to say, is Marie Mikula, a professor of philosophy and chair of metaphysics at the University of Amsterdam. Her areas of expertise are in feminist metaphysics, social ontology, and pornography debates in philosophy. She's published widely on these topics, amongst others, in the monographies The Wrong of Injustice, Dehumanization and Its Role in Feminist Philosophy, and Pornography, A Philosophical Introduction. Marie.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for having me and for having written the book and for the commentaries so far and for all of you who've come to listen to us tonight. Can I just check, because I'm not a usual user of this kind of computer, how do I move the PowerPoint?
I think there's a clicker.
But I can also just use it from here, right? Okay, well, hopefully this will work. Okay, so thanks. Indeed, I also do recommend that everyone finishes the book and just, buys the book, reads it. It's really, really worth it. So I echo all the nice things that have been said. I also have a bad feeling that I might be here the person who quashes the hope. Petra just said that in the end we get some hope, and I'm now going to say some critical parts about the hope part. Okay, so here's okay, great. So Manon sets out, after having discussed extensively all the problems that there are in various notions of consent, her solution of consent as conversation. And here are some lengthier quotes in the assumption that most of you have not read the book about what that solution is. So here's the first one: talk to each other. If the aim is to contest gender injustices while preserving the sexual autonomy of all, then sexual consent, conceived as an erotic conversation, is the future of love and sex. So in sexual conversation, the participants note each other's potentially shifting desires, movements, situation. The focus is on a deeply relational character of sexual practice. And to understand good sex as a conversation is also to distinguish it from a dialogue or a discussion. And the term conversation here emphasizes collaboration, the fact that the partners are working towards a common goal, rather than talking possibly past one another or trying to kind of advance their own arguments. And so what I want to say is I want to challenge this notion of consent as conversation. And by doing that, I'm going to be doing something like just a super box standard philosophy type thing, namely just start looking at kind of philosophy of language debates. And I'll say something about how that connects to Manon's idea of consent as conversation. So let's think about norms of ordinary conversations. So not about sexual conversations, just ordinary conversations that we have with people all the time. It's kind of a standard idea is that conversations are, in philosophy of language terms, enabled by some accepted or presupposed norms, that there's something what's known as the common ground that undergirds our conversations. So there's a set of some sort of propositions or presuppositions or meanings that are accepted or taken as true by the interlocutors, and there is at least warranted belief that this common ground is shared among interlocutors. I mean, just really simply put, if we don't understand one another, if there's no shared meanings, I mean, we just simply cannot have any conversation whatsoever. I mean, that seems to be, these are the kinds of things that we are. There is some common ground that we have in any conversation we have, whether it's about sex or whether it's about cups of coffee. So the thought there is, otherwise we need to have something like a shared sort of space of shared meanings to have any type of interaction, conversation. Otherwise, we're just systematically talking past, or sort of talking past each other or at cross purposes. There's lots of reasons how this interaction can kind of go wrong. If, for instance, we might not understand some terminology, for instance, saying something like, she's such a Karen. When that first started popping up, I was really confused. I'm like, okay, so who's Karen? But I mean, this is a slang term that has a particular meaning. If you don't know that, you're not going to understand the notion. Or a kind of an American sort of, we can have a kind of a shift or disruption in the common ground, like in the American case, like, let's get lunch. And then, if you're from Finland, like I am, that's like taken really seriously. It's like literally, oh dear, somebody really wants to have lunch with me, but it's kind of not the idea. It's just sort of something that you say. You're not really expected to. You're not really being invited to go to lunch with someone. So, okay. Now, what about then the norms of sexual conversation? Well, think about it again, is that there's kind of, we can have a sort of a lack of shared literal meanings or lack of shared pragmatic understandings about what's being said. And now the thought is that, if we don't have this sort of shared common ground, then we cannot have genuine conversations. They're just impossible. The genuine conversations are premised on this kind of shared common ground. And what Manon does really convincingly for many, many chapters until we get to the last chapter is show us precisely how consent talk misfires, how it's problematic. And given that that's the case, then I got to wondering, how confident can we really be that there is this kind of necessary common ground to engage in sexual conversations? You do such an excellent job of, if you like, convincing us that there is some common ground that's missing, that I then started wondering whether this kind of conversation is at all possible. I tend to think, perhaps I'm just now too old and jaded, but pessimistically, that there is actually very little sexual common ground that enables these kinds of sexual conversations. And it seems that if that's the case, then consent as conversation, as things stand, is not is not really possible. I mean, remember that the claim here is that to understand good sex as conversation is something different from a dialogue or a discussion. And my worry is that maybe the necessary conversational conditions just don't, in fact, obtain. Of course, what we can understand Manon doing here in this sorts of claim, for instance, could be making like not a descriptive claim about how things are, but a normative claim about what good sex ought to be, even if it isn't at the moment, which I think is fair enough. But how do we then create these kinds of conditions for sexual common ground to enable sexual conversations in the sense that that would that, if you like, what good sex ought to be isn't just some sort of an ideal that we can strive for, but actually something that is realized, something that is in reality. Well, again, the one solution we already had was talk to one another. Fair enough. But again, I'm just worrying that if the meaningful and genuine conversational kind of pre-existing common ground isn't there, then this, talking to one another is only going to take us very far. Well, I mean, it's not going to take us very far. I suppose that's the idea. It doesn't look like it's going to be a very efficacious solution. Now, what about another one? I mean, which you sort of certainly hint at in the book, is that we should sort of disrupt gender normativity and contest gender injustices and sort of the background unjust conditions that have led to us to where we are now. Sure, absolutely on board. But how do we then do that, which is another enormously complicated and difficult matter? Well, at some point towards the end, you also hint at sexual scripts as being a solution. And here's another quote. You say the scripts might be useful in creating the conditions for more people to have sex. And so basically, it's a kind of thing that's you could have access to certain type of education within society that provides opportunities for sexual autonomy, and scripts can give us some helpful guidance on how to do that. So I don't disagree, but I also just wondered about the kind of role of sexual scripts, and especially what kinds of scripts might be helpful. Because it looks to me that at the moment, I mean, as things stand, our sexual lives are very much kind of inundated and suffused with sexual scripts, but of exactly the wrong kind. So we've got to have somehow sort of the right kinds of sexual scripts that can sort of enable this kind of sexual conversation, consent as conversation, and then enhance opportunities for sexual autonomy. I mean, this is a kind of the very common critique leveled at sort of contemporary pornography industry, that it sort of provides this kind of one-sided, run-of-the-mill, heteronormative, heterosexist, racist, ableist, kind of lazy sexual scripts that are not autonomy-enhancing, and that's what's kind of hurting, partly what's hurting our sexual lives. But that isn't just the kind of the view of anti-pornography feminism, it's also very much the view of those involved in feminist alternative ethical pornography productions. And so might this alternative ethical pornography provide better sexual scripts for us to kind of create the conversational conditions for for consent as conversation? So here's one prominent characterization of what feminist pornography as a genre is from Tristan Taormino's and others' edited book called The Feminist Porn Book. So this is a genre that uses sexually explicit imagery to contest and complicate dominant representations of gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and so on, explores concepts of desire, agency, power at their most confounding and difficult, also against the limits of gender hierarchy and heteronormativity and homonormativity, and it creates alternative images and develops its particular aesthetic to expand our sexual norms and discourses. So what about this? What is, I mean, I think, of course, it's one thing to provide alternative sexual scripts and for those to be taken up by people. And I certainly don't think that feminist porn alternatives are the only sort of solution here. But nonetheless, I wondered, what I thought was striking is that there's very little in the book that opens this up as a possibility. So pornography is very much discussed largely in a sort of a negative way, and sort of as undermining the kind of sexual common ground and our sexual autonomy. And what I wanted to kind of push you a little bit about and to thinking is that maybe the potential of emancipatory porn to kind of create alternative sexual scripts is something that should be taken seriously. I mean, of course, there's so much more that could be said about this, but I do not have the time to do that. Still, I'm, and this is the part where I feel like I'm crushing all the hope in the room, so I'm so sorry about that at the moment. I'm not sure if I kind of dare to believe that sexual common ground is achievable. And maybe this is just an enormously pessimistic view from my part. But if it isn't, I mean, how far is it that we can take this idea of consent as conversation? Which I find a very, very attractive idea. I'm just not quite sure how workable it is unless we have kind of better conditions first in place. I mean, I look forward to exploring the idea further despite my pessimism, but perhaps maybe, Manon, you also have some further hopeful words to say in response to my pessimism of, hope is a dangerous thing. But thank you very much in any case.
I would like to ask my guests on stage and Manon to respond. But Lilian and Petra, please take a seat and ask why.
Okay, so I could take a few hours to respond to this, but I think I can't. So I'm just again gonna plug off this computer. Sorry for these walls of computers. So first of all, thank you for these great comments. And what also brings me joy is how different they were. Petra, I wanted to say that I think, I don't know exactly, but I've probably have done one way or another around 50 things around this book in different countries, etc. And no one has ever acknowledged the work that it is to work on this and the kind of involvement. So I have decided to not to objectify the objects by because I think also there's a whole genre of writing about sexual assault in the first person, and that is very well done. And even in philosophy, one of my big inspirations in this book is Susan Bryson, who does that wonderfully. And so I wanted to be apparently out of it. But I really appreciate that you saw that. And it really moved me. And I really liked also your image of the Trojan horse of consent, because of course I'm teaching, I was teaching a class on psychoanalysis this semester, and so the Trojan horse as a penis seems like a very, so that's very interesting. Sorry, I guess that's what psychoanalysis does to you, you started seeing penises everywhere. So about your questions, and I think there's something. So first about the battle and the hunt, I agree with you 100%. I think it's what I had in mind was that. So it's probably a problem of translation. That in France, in the history of the 18th century, etc., in literature, there's this common topos that keeps coming back in literature of the La Bataille des Sexes. And so the battle of the sexes is just a calque, a reproduction in translation of this idea. But of course, what I'm trying what I was hoping to try to show is that this battle of the sexes is much more a hunt-prey system. And it's very interesting. In France, we have this adage that is l'homme propose, la femme dispose. So it's like the man proposes and the woman, it's not really disposes, it's like acquiesces or not. And so I think this is, the battle of the sexes is presented as a neutral, like two sides thing when it's when it's in fact a hunting and prey system. And then, so something that would be probably a response to both Marie and Petra. So my model of the sexual conversation, so the way I frame it, the way I frame things in the book, I think there are two questions. There is a question of what is right and wrong sex. So what kind of sex is permissible and impermissible? So what should be forbidden? And then what is good and not good sex? And I think it's important to distinguish them also as a sort of response to a certain view of moral philosophy. So you have kind of two big questions in moral philosophy of what is happiness and what is justice, or and so I'm trying to say for very good reasons we've become very wary of the idea that we should have something to say substantively about what good sex is, because all the people who have been saying things substantively about what good sex is ended up promoting a sort of monogamous, heterosexist, religious model. And so that's also what I'm trying to go against in the book, is to say we should be able to say something substantively about what good sex looks like that is saying what a good one-night stand looks like, what a good Grindr encounter that lasts 10 minutes look like, what does a good polyamorous sex look like, but that could like allow for heterosexual sex, non-heterosexual sex, trans sex, cis sex, like queer sex, but that still tries to say something substantive. And really, my idea of the conversation is when you're not in the realm of impermissibility, what can good sex look like? And so I don't think it's a good model to eliminate sexual violence. I think it's a good model once you're in a non-sexual violence situation to think about how to make things better. But I do agree that there's we know that fundamentally it's more likely that it's going to be women because they're socialized about care, etc., that are going to propose this conversation, that are going to make this conversation possible, that they might get stuck in feeling responsible for this conversation. But precisely what I'm trying to say is that you know how there's this now well-understood idea that racism is a problem of white people. Well, I want to say consent is a problem of men. So it's not about, and not in the sense that it's only men having sex with women, but what we know for sure is that it's really mostly men exerting sexual violence. So the figures, depending on studies, is between 97% and 99% of acts of sexual violence are committed by men, being on children, on women, and on other men. And so that's why I think it's men's responsibility to create this conversation. And so it's a bit like the Spider-Man thing or Superman, I never know which one it is. With great powers come great responsibilities. I think what we see with a conversation is that when you have a conversation with a power dynamic in it or inside a power relation, it is the person who has the power that needs to try to level the ground. And so instead of having a model of consent that is the liberal model of consent where we say, okay, so let's pretend we're equal and we can consent, which is kind of what is presented to us in the libertarian model of consent, to say, let's see that the real situation is that we're never equal among people who have sex. And so it's the people who are in position of power that need to take responsibility and create this conversation. And so I say it's men, but there are cases where for class reasons, for race reasons, for sexuality reasons, it might not be men. So you could imagine a situation where if you're in the US and you're a black man having sex with a white woman, she knows and you know that if she says if she was raped, she's going to be believed. So there's going to be...
I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but you're talking.
Yeah, sorry. So I want
to say
so
5 more minutes for response.
Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, what I wanted to say is that maybe it's on the white woman to initiate the conversation about consent because there's this power relation. So briefly... I agree. So I don't know if it was really questions. I agree with everything you said, Liliane. And it's true that I'm trying to respond to this tension about the sexual revolution that was clearly a progress, but also clearly a trap. And the way there are some disillusionments about feminism, and also the way... there's something wrong going on with men and sex. And so I think I was very interested. So Dan Savage has this view that the Republicans in the US are trying to make men unfuckable because then they will become bitter and vote for the conservatives. And I think there's something very interesting. So it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but he argues for it very convincingly. And I think there's something like that going on where it might be more than just a sort of political social democrat gesture to tell men to be on board. But we can talk more about this. And Marie, I agree with you in theory about feminist porn. But my worry about feminist porn is just that only people who are already convinced watch it. And I think we're in a situation of monopoly of the big platforms, and that the porn that is mostly watched by people is the mainstream porn that is providing these terrible scripts. And so in the book, when I talk about scripts, I'm thinking about something way more precise, like actual scripts, because I was taking this idea from bioethics, where they realized that it's very difficult for doctors and patients to have real conversation where doctors really make the effort of figuring out exactly what the patient has understood and not understood, etc. And so they provide actual sentences with saying, you say this. If the patient responds this, then the next question would be to do this. So these are the different kinds of response you can have to that question, and they might mean this, or that. And so I think it seems a bit like really not sexy, but I think there's still something about it in the development of a vocabulary and of a sensitivity about language that might be important. And that connects to what you were saying about your worries that there's no common ground. I think precisely what I found very interesting in the research I did for this book is that we're taught to believe that if men exert sexual violence is because they don't understand what women want or what women say, and that there's fundamentally a misunderstanding. And I think, and the recent research shows that men understand perfectly well that they're just socialized and encouraged to not care. And so that you could consider that it's part of the lack of common ground, but I think there it means that a conversation is possible. The question is how to convince men that they should be having it. And I think there it might be what I'm trying to do with showing men that there's good sex and good lives to be had that way. But it's true that I've been really careful with this argument of you're gonna get the best sex in your life by being a feminist, because it rubs me the wrong way on so many levels of like treating men like all they care about is sex and not justice. And also, you know, like, why would men be on board just because they want to like have better orgasms? Really, like, I don't think that's the good strategy. But I think the strategy that I tried to implement was to write that book. And instead of calling it something feminist, I decided to call it something sort of economic. How do you say, like that would welcome everyone, and also, like, I put sex in the title, in the French and German title, and well, especially in the French title. And so, what I saw is that actually a lot of, so with my first book that is called "We're Not Born Submissive," only women read it. So it was pretty successful in France, but like my male colleagues would write to me saying, "Oh, my wife really liked your book." And with this one, and so it was put in sociology and in gender, in bookstores, etc. My second book, because it has philosophy is in the subtitle and sex in the main title in French, it was put in philosophy and it was read by men, and especially by older men. And it was very striking for me, like in a lot of bookstores, there were a lot of men and friends of my parents, and who told me, "Oh, wow, like I read this and I realized actually I probably fucked up in many ways, and it's really difficult to be a woman, and yeah, it really gave me a different perspective." So some of them were like, "Wow, good thing that there's the last chapter." But I was hoping precisely to make a gesture towards this common ground and this building of a vocabulary with the book.
Thank you, Manon. Please come sit here. First, I would like to give the panel maybe a chance to engage, to respond to what Manon said.
We have to?
I don't know, you may if you want to, but you don't have to.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Petra?
Thank you for your extensive response. I was thinking, hearing you speaking, that it's important to have the right conditions to be able to have, and maybe that's also what we're looking for. What are these right conditions to have that? And then you say it in the book yourself, social change, feminist activism. But it's as if we're like back at starting point, because we have to change things and then we can have this conversation. And it's actually for that reason that I really wanted to put forward that figure of Scheherazade, because I think that this conversational consent is indeed interesting for specific reasons if you want to make your sex life better in a certain way, and it's you have a very specific Kantian view on what a better sex life is, and with all its merit, and I think it's also very coherent in certain ways with what we can expect from a better sex life. Yet I would propose this kind of model of sexual ethics rather for lesbian relationships. For me, it resonates a lot with like Audre Lorde's The Power of the Erotic and her poem Recreation. We write so much better when we have been na. So, I mean, there it's this common ground that you're also talking about, but there's also the socialization process of care. And I would rather, and I really fully share your pessimism, develop sexual ethics for heterosexual relations. That's more for me an ethics of plotting and planning and cunning and foxing and whatever. Because there is also in this, and again from a perspective of creating structures of solidarity amongst women, being in a heterosexual sexual ethics, there is a condition. It can work. It can work as an ethics of plotting and planning if you're like in the harem, and that's like symbolic or metaphorically a community of women that together plot and plan, and take and give, etc. And yeah, I think we can have different sexual ethics considering different power relations. I mean, now I'm going on. Yeah, I just wanted to share something that was at the end and I didn't read. It's for me, it's very much related because I'm also sometimes wondering: is this conversational ethics, conversational consent as a sexual ethics, not the next expression of empathy? And it's coming also from very specific contexts, heterosexual women who are very often monogamous, etc. And at the end of my talk, I wanted to share a vision or a memory I have of my mother, who was a single mother, a poor mother, who was living with a woman. They shared a place. She called it a pigeonhole, so a very small apartment. And they had sex with guys in return for sexual luxuries. They didn't need it for the money. They had enough. There was a welfare state, and we didn't have many needs. But I can remember so well, they're laughing, they're giggling out loud, talking about these guys, about how they couldn't get it up, how they had fucked them. They never said we got fucked. How they fucked them, how they talked about the pleasures they got out of it, but they never told the guys where they got the pleasure out of. So there's also the idea of glissant, of the opacity. Don't be too transparent of your pleasure, of your desires. But there's also the place of healing, of crying together, of taking care of each other, but also of having bodily pleasure together. So I think there's more complexity there than finding the one solution of the conversational consent, regardless of existing power relations that we're involved in.
Maybe also a rejection of being the weaker sex is what I hear in that as well. Yeah, and the hunt is exactly the subject takes an object, or that he has, and he is often he, has sculpted into an object, whereas in the battle there's two subjects, or the trying to get out of the state of the object and being a subject and fight.
I see your point, but what worries me is that if we think that this is all we can get from heterosexual sex, I think we should choose to be lesbians. Because but in the sense that I think it's really like, why bother have sex with men if that's really, like, if we need to condemn, if we need to like think it, to laugh about how like they don't understand anything about our pleasure, etc. Like, I'm really not saying this as like an absurd thing. I think if there are good grounds to think we should be lesbians, but I think if we think that there's love in the sex that we have, not like it can be love like friendships, if it's a friend with benefit or something like that, then there needs to be an idea that that we could make it work, that it's not doomed for failure. And I think that's partly, like we were talking about the fact that young people have less and less sex, and so young men, but also young women. In France, at least, the new studies show that also young women have less sex. And I think it's because some people think the situation is not there for a happy thing to happen. And fair enough, but what I was trying to do is more thinking, okay, like what would it look like if we were taking, if there are people who are well-meaning? Because I do think that there are, and that links to what you were saying, Liliane, about like this sort of possibility of peace maybe, is that I do think that there are some guys who are well-meaning and who are constructed with these ideas about masculinity, etc. And so to say, like, if we really work together towards something with some people,
teacher voices.
Yeah.
I think it's coming back.
Yeah.
Marie.
Yeah, just really, really quickly about the feminist porn point that, people who watch it are people who are kind of already on board. Okay, fair enough. But then again, people who buy your book are also kind of already on board. Yeah. I mean, maybe the situation in France is a bit different, but I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people here or in many countries I've lived in who go and buy books from philosophy sections at bookshops are kind of already on board as well. I mean, it's not
I'm going to take that as a bridge because we don't have much time left and all these people are on board because they came here. So I want to open the possibility to the floor to ask some questions. Please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to reach you. I see somebody here who's dressed really nicely has a question.
Yes, hello.
You're all dressed very nicely, but she's just dressed a little bit nicer.
I think I wanted to jump in on the mention of lesbian relationships. I was in a lesbian relationship, not anymore, but whatever. But during the relationship, I of course had sex. But whenever I would have sex, I would feel like a dirty old pervert man, kind of. So I think my question is on the regards of like, also I guess there's also well-meaning men. People can get like scared because of consent, or like I know I also recently did a workshop on consent with the wheel of consent. I think it's a model often used in BDSM. But I thought it was very interesting, and I don't know if you also know of this wheel of consent. Maybe this is more like the practical part of it.
But I have a whole chapter on BDSM in the book, but I didn't know about the wheel model specifically.
Betty Martin, I think is her name, Wheel of Consent.
Yes, but I don't really know what my question is, but I think it's just like... well, there's also something to think about, like...
I think you wanted to ask something about, are people going to be scared of consent? Was that your question?
Or maybe, like, well, if people are having less sex, maybe they're also afraid to have sex and, like, afraid to cross boundaries. So, I don't know.
This is something that we hear a lot. Young people in the Netherlands, other countries as well, are starting with sex later on. There's reason to believe people are having less sex. So this common concern about talks of consent making sex into a minefield. Lilian, you also wanted to...
So when I raised this point, it wasn't really to suggest that the pitch to men is that they'll have the best sex of their lives in this way. It was more to suggest that if it's true that relationships in which consent is fraught in the way you describe you describe them as alienating. And I guess I was describing a situation of alienation that's somewhat broader than sex. So the reason it's relevant to say that not all is well in the world of boys and men is that we are talking about alienation, unemployment, isolation, because the same surveys say people don't have friends. So it's not just that they're not having sex, they're going out less. They're partying less, they're meeting less people. So we live in a social system that isolates people and creates such social atomism that might, to me, that's the more obvious background condition for why people might struggle to connect with others in sexual relationships. The stakes of getting it wrong or being rejected or being intimidated by these various factors get much worse if you're just not out there or you don't have enough time to experiment because you don't know enough people and you don't have any friends. So like I guess my comment was trying to connect the issue of sexual alienation to a broader social alienation, and that broader social alienation is one of inequality and disintegration of social life, and inequality produces violence, and violence is sexual. That was the line of thought.
Yeah. Do you want to respond, Manon?
I want to say that if people are skeptical about what Lilian is saying, there was a wonderful skit by the Saturday Night Live that was called The Husband Park or something like that, where it was women bringing their husbands to the park, but on the model of the dog park, and encouraging them to like connect with each other. And it was like all on a model of dogs like sniffing each other and being like, "Do you like baseball?" And like this. And it was really like, and they were like, "Yes, you did it, and we'll come again tomorrow, and you can do more bonding." And so I think there is a real situation of loneliness and alienation that is part of this.
Because also in relation to that, with this isolation and atomization, which is clearly also connected to digitalization, where should we have these conversations?
Well, it depends. So I think what is a bit blurry about my idea about conversation and on purpose is that I think we need to have conversation. We need to conceive of sex as a conversation, but in order to conceive of sex as a conversation, there's a sort of possible virtuous loop. And so that's kind of my response to the worries about the structural and the individual, is that when I talk about social movements and their impact is because I want to counter this sort of find your personal goddess and learn how to have good sex, etc., as if it's an individual thing. I think there is only so far you can go in terms of personal emancipation. So that's why, and for me, it was very clear with Me Too, the difference between my students and me, what happened in 10 years, it's really crazy. And no personal quest for consent or something would have rendered that possible. But I also think that there is a virtuous circle where you can learn to practice sex in a certain way and develop a vocabulary that you can then use when you talk with your friends, etc., and find words to describe your pleasure, to shape your own, what I call as your sexual subjectivity, and that this development of a vocabulary is also creating the possibility of those conversation and of also conversation with younger people or older people about what is sex, what it can feel like, what are good projects to have about your sexual lives. I don't think sexual education should be only in schools. I think it should be also in retirement homes, at work. We should find ways to have conversations about sex that make sex less of a taboo thing, and so something where we become better. And an image that I use for that, I think it seems weird, but a lot of people think, it's going to be so awkward to talk about sex, and it's not going to make it feel sexier or more pleasurable. But about this, I'm French, and so my view about this is you would never go to a gastronomy restaurant alone, because part of the pleasure of an incredibly good meal is to talk about how good it is, and it makes it better. You don't agree? No. Yeah. Well,
I mean, maybe I'm more socialized as a woman than you are, but
please use a microphone.
Yeah.
So when I'm with someone, I'm concentrating on the person, not on the food. So when I go to a really good restaurant, I'd rather go alone.
This is also something we're already over time. If there is one really pressing question, I see one hand going up in the back, so that will also be the final question there.
I just wanted to hear your insight on the importance of consent within sapphic relationships, between women or people who are women adjacent, because I know that I personally have had harmful experiences sexually with people that weren't men, so I disagree with your idea that consent is a male issue. So I'd just like to see where that kind of fits into your methodology here.
Yeah.
Thank you for making me clarify. So what I mean by saying consent is a men issue is in heterosexual relationship, consent is the responsibility of men rather than of women. But when you're in a relationship with no man, there is a question of power relation. Who has more power? Who's going to feel more intimidated or less able to speak because it's like you're less experienced, or because the other person is more popular, but in general, I think we should just have a sort of idea that we share responsibility in any case. Even when I say like it's men's responsibility, I don't mean that it means the woman can do whatever they want, but more something like the responsibility is not a responsibility to stop things, but it's a responsibility to know if you can continue.
Thank you. I want to thank all my guests. Petra van Brabant, Lilian Cicciattia, Marie Mikola. Special thanks to Erik Slieser all the way in the back for organizing this. Thanks to Spui 25 for hosting this. Of course, a big up to Manon Garcia for being here and being the star of this event. All the way from Berlin. And my final thank you is to you for listening so breathlessly. I think there's a lot to think about, but also a lot to talk about. So your assignment for the coming weekend, I would say, is have a conversation about good sex. Enjoy. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. You want to say? Almost forgetting, there's a book signing, so you can buy a book here, and then Manon is signing in the corner there. Thanks, everybody.